you'd be so kind as to stand to your feet to embrace our brother, our friend, our intern, Minister Devon Crawford. We give God praise for this brother.
I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Are there any grateful people in this house today? Are there any grateful people in this house? If so, you ought to say something. You ought to clap your hands. You ought to give thanks on this morning. Amen. Indeed, it is a pleasure and an honor to stand at this sacred desk with this beautiful congregation. I want to thank the pastoral staff, the administrative staff, the deacons, board of directors, trustees, the staff of Andaleo, the members of this village of Trinity United Church of Christ, to Reverend Stacy, the executive minister and my internship coordinator, and to the pastor, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. I thank you for this immense opportunity. It has certainly been a blessing to me, and I cherish it. Thank you. And I have a few members of my family that are here. Once again, I would like to acknowledge my parents, my mother and my father, who flew all the way from Birmingham, Alabama for this day. And those who are watching online, we thank God for streaming faith. I also have the Boyd family who came from Naperville, Illinois. They have come. Appreciate you. And my brother from Alpha Rho chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, from Morehouse College, Brother Michael Cox. Thank you, brother. Amen. This past 7 weeks, I've certainly learned so much. You have taught me, you have encouraged me, you have cared for me, and you have loved me. And for that, I am eternally grateful to Trinity United Church of Christ. And it does not yet appear what we shall be, Minister Portia and myself, but I can truly say that we are better people and better ministers because we have been with these people in this church. Now there is a word from the Lord. It's found in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. It's been read before, I'll read it one more time from the New Revised Standard Version. I know we've been here for a while, but I won't take up too much of your time. Just permit me about 2 hours of your time and we'll make our way along. Amen. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. And it reads as such. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. And as he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. For the moments that are ours, I'd like to speak to you on this subject, raising our hopes. Raising our hopes. Brothers and sisters, one of my favorite things to do as a kid was to watch films about some of my favorite superheroes. I'd love watching movies about Batman and Robin as they thwarted another one of the Joker's malicious schemes to bring chaos to Gotham City. Or watching Superman as he devised another attempt to counter another one of Lex Luthor's attempts to destroy Metropolis and the world. I love watching the aerobics of Spider-Man as he swung around and about the buildings of New York City while fighting some of the wildest characters you could imagine, such as Sandman, the Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and one of my favorites, the Hobgoblin. I love watching the Hulk smash any and everything that Stan Lee tried to create. And even in recent years, I've been excited in watching the adventures of Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Hulk, the Black Widow, Nick Fury, as they assembled in the climactic feature film, The Avengers. But one of my favorite parts about each movie happens after the credits finish rolling. I'd quietly chuckle to myself as I'd watch 2 or 3 people at a time leave the theater because they obviously did not know that the film wasn't over. After the credits of each movie, there was always a final scene or a final clip that was suggestive of the coming movie, the sequel that would disrupt everything that was already established in the prior film. Whether it was a villain coming back, a new development of the story, there was always a final clip that let us know that there was a bigger and better production in our future. In church, many times we find ourselves in the movie theaters of our lives where we think that the movie is over. We think that the situation is over. The final scene has played, the credits begin to roll, we begin to throw away our popcorn, and it seems as if we try to place periods in our lives where God has simply placed a comma. But church, thank God for those people in our lives that are here to remind us that the last scene is still to come. What we thought was a sad ending is only a vibrant beginning, and a better production is in our future. And we find that this is the case for this widowed mother found in the 7th chapter of Luke. Her son has died. And she believes that this is the end of yet another chapter in her life. The funeral service has ended, the songs have been sung, the rituals have been performed, and now she has to begin this long and arduous walk across the city to bury her only child. And however, as she trudges across this hillside, she's interrupted by an unfamiliar face, which shows compassion for her. He stops this procession and urges her, "Do not weep," as to indicate that the story is far from over. And of course, this unfamiliar face is Jesus. As Jesus approaches the city of Nain, he sees something that he cannot ignore. Jesus notices the funeral procession of this young man and the grief in his mother's eyes. Her face is well acquainted with tears, and hope strains from her heart. As Jesus sees the swelling crowds of people who've come to pay their respects to yet another young man whose potential has been halted by death. He sees these circumstances, he sees these people, whom many of us, if we were to be honest with ourselves, would simply allow to pass us by. He saw the hurdles of their hurt, the permanence of their pain, and the gravity of their grief. In church, many times, people, situations pass by us who beckon our attention, who should not be ignored when they pass by us. I'll say that one more time for your sakes. There are many people and circumstances that simply pass us by, who beckon our attention, who should not be ignored when they pass by us. When schools become dilapidated in our districts while prisons are built at alarming rates, we should not ignore it. When our students opt to sell drugs throughout the week instead of staying in our classrooms to cultivate their minds, we should not ignore it. When 20 people can die in Chicago in less than 72 hours over gun violence, over turf that does not even belong to them, we should not ignore it. When the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin is sanctioned by a stand-your-ground law and a jury that decides that George Zimmerman is not guilty after pumping a bullet in a young man's heart, we should not ignore it, church. When 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson is murdered in Valdosta, Georgia, and the sheriff's department does all they can do to prolong justice for this young man's family, we should not ignore it. When members of Congress decide to debate whether or not they should raise the student loan rates and the Supreme Court loses their minds by dismantling the Civil Rights Act of 1965 as if voter suppression laws or voter ID laws are simply a myth, we should not ignore it. When our women are seen as sexualized objects to be lusted after instead of sisters to be adored and respected, we should not ignore it. When men are seen as estranged enemies instead of brothers who are made in the very likeness of God, church, we should not ignore it. Brothers and sisters, is there anybody in here who can emphatically agree that there are some people and some things and some situations that should not be ignored when they pass by us? But the blessing, church, is that Jesus was not willing to allow another deadly, dangerous, and grievous situation to simply pass him by. Particularly, he was not willing to allow another young person to be buried in an early grave with unfulfilled potential. When we look at this situation, Scripture tells us that the boy is dead. What it neglects to tell us is how he died. And I think for this moment, it's important for us to look at some of the potential causes of this death. Could it be that he fallen victim to suicide? Or was it that he was caught in the crossfires of some violent exchange? Or was it simply that he was diagnosed with a terminal illness? Or was it simply another drug overdose? Brothers and sisters, as young people, there are some things that we need to watch out for. Some people we need to watch out for. Some circumstances we need to watch out for, because none of our families want to bury us before it is our time. None of our families want to bury us before it is our time. And many times we are doing some dumb things that place us in dangerous situations and compromise the safety of others. Now, I'm reminded of a song by India.Arie entitled "Slow Down," which chorus offers a similar caution. Is anybody familiar with that song, Slow Down? Slow down. Okay, a handful. I love y'all. 7:30, okay. Yeah, well, she offers a similar caution in the song Slow Down when she says, "Slow down, baby. You're going too fast. You got your hands in the air with your feet on the gas. You're about to wreck your future, run from your past. You need to slow down before you go down, baby." Young men, slow down and respect the women around you. Pull up your hopes and pull up your dreams and know that greatness is always in front of you. Young women, slow down. You don't need to wear clothes that reveal every inch of your body. Slow down and love. Slow down and live. Slow down and live your life to its greatest potential. Yeah, Jesus was not willing to allow another young person to be buried in an early grave with unfulfilled potential, because he realized that young people, we represent a bit more than ourselves. We represent some timely investments and some transcendent truths. Young people represent our grandmother's answered prayers. We represent our grandfather's hopes. Particularly young African-American children represent a people, a black people, a defiant people who survived the transatlantic slave trade and unfettered chattel slavery, endured public lynchings and bloodied auction blocks and flesh-ripping lashes of whips made of cane, woven cord, reed, and cowhide, who sought freedom from the antebellum South, sought liberation from oppressive racism, and we produce some of the most brilliant sainted sages of our history. We represent the Sojourner Truths, the Denmark Vesey's, the Harriet Tubmans, the Nat Turners, the Mary McLeod Bethunes, the Septima Poinsett Clarks. We represent the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Ella Bakers, the Thurgood Marshalls, the Shirley Chisholms. We represent the Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s, the Samuel DeWitt Proctors, the Frederick Shuttlesworths, the John Thomas Porters. We represent the Jeremiah A. Wright Jr.'s, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Howard Washington Thurmans, the Benjamin Elijah Mays, the Otis Moss Jr.'s. I represent an Augustus Caesar Dickinson Sr. and Elizabeth Davis Dickinson and an Elizabeth Bowie. Young people represent a great cloud of witnesses. Jesus recognized the value, the relevance, and the witness of young people, Reverend Stacy. And this is why he had to interrupt this funeral procession in the city of Nain and caution this widowed mother not to weep. Because Jesus saw something that others could not see. Jesus saw life where others saw death. He saw potential where others saw problems. But this is easier said than done. It takes courage to provide life where death is pervasive. And Trinity United Church of Christ knows about providing life in dead situations. When you've raised the awareness of the apartheid in South Africa, when you've provided a sanctuary for our young boys and girls to learn in our freedom school, when you've spoken truth to power in the case of Trayvon Martin, when you've spoken truth to power in the case of voting rights, Trinity United Church of Christ knows about providing life where death is pervasive, and I thank God for your ministry. And many of us are surrounded by people and circumstances that can easily be assumed as dead situations. It's easy to assume death in our communities when our people are seemingly trapped in endless cycles of drug abuse and physical abuse. It's easy to assume death in our communities when the bodies of black men and women are killed senselessly and warehoused in prisons disproportionately. It's easy to assume death in our communities when we see men and women who don't consider themselves beautifully and handsomely made, just the way you are. You are beautifully and handsomely made, just the way you are, without weave, without tattoos, without extensive jewelry, without revealing clothes. You are beautifully and handsomely made, just the way you are. It's easy to assume death in our communities when they are occupied with vacant business buildings, vacant schools, vacant churches that have lost the innovative minds that push us forward in our global community. Beloved, it's easy to assume death in our communities when corporations produce and promote media that presents a feigned interpretation of black people as a mistrusting, apathetic, inferior, insecure, stereotypical, jealous, petty, selfish, materialistic, greedy, poverty-stricken, and persecuted people. We must not believe the lies of the people that will tell us that we are ugly, docile, uncultured, ignorant, blind, stupid, thuggish, or gangster. That is not who we are. That is who our detractors would say that we are. Our communities are not dead. There is much life in us. Jesus affirms this notion in the 14th verse when he walks to the bier and says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." Beloved, Jesus sees a young man that he cannot ignore. Though this man is assumed to be dead in this context, Jesus knows that the possibility of life is still in him. And he walks to the mother and tells her not to weep. However, this is a heavy statement because, she's walked this path before. As I said before, she is a widowed mother, meaning her husband has already died. And she's gone through this cycle of grief before, but maybe even on a more deeper level now, because this was her baby. And a woman's livelihood at this time was contingent upon the men to whom she was related. And so now she's situated in a terrible social circumstance and is preparing to bury her future. Yeah. But Jesus still has hope. And with that, he walks to the bier, places his hands on the boy, and says, "Rise." And the truth of the matter is, all we need to do is rise. All we need to do is rise. There is already something in us that helps us to transcend all that tries to destroy us. And notice that Jesus does not simply utter this command from a distance, but he places his hands on the boy and says to him, "Rise." And brothers and sisters, in order for us to rise, in order for our communities to rise, we need some close and personal contact with our people, with our situations, with our communities. It requires our hands. It requires our feet. It requires our eyes. It requires our minds. And most importantly, it requires our hearts. We can rise by tutoring our young boys and girls and becoming active participants in their learning process. We can rise by promoting healthy living standards, such as exercising and eating responsibly. We can rise by investing in our local businesses and schools. We can rise by becoming slow to anger and quick to love. We can rise by holding our politicians accountable for the service which they render unto us. We can rise, for we have gifts abounding, resources untold, and assets in abundance, and talents in plenty. God has commissioned us to champion our causes, confront our enemies, sustain our struggles, and win our battles. We just need to rise. God did not make you to fall victims to early graves. And it was at this moment when Jesus turned the funeral procession into a family reunion. The young man sits up, begins to speak, and Jesus gives him to his mother. Now, I pretty much said all the heavy things I need to say this morning, just for your information. But as I was reading this portion, the young man sits up, begins to speak, and Jesus gives him to his mother. There was this question that was nagging me. This question that was burning inside of me. And when I tell you, it may not sound like much to you. But for this past week, it's really just gotten the life of me. And the question was simply, what did the boy say? That's all. What did he say? And for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. So Pastor Moss, I decided to use my holy homiletic imagination and employ some eisegetical insight. And I invited this young man to my house last night. That's right, all the way from this hillside city of Nain to Hyde Park in Chicago. I invited him to my living room, and as we sat down and shared a cup of coffee, I asked the man, I casually leaned over and asked him, what was it that you could possibly say to Jesus? After you've been raised from the dead. What can you say? And he sat back and began to reminisce on the moment because, he's a cool guy. This doesn't happen to everybody, And, he sat back and he said, there were many things that I could have said. There are many things that I would have said. Because it was Jesus. He was the only person who saw my potential to live. It's because of Jesus that my tomorrow is a reality for me, ripe with new possibilities. It's because of Jesus that my mother did not have to continue down that road to bury her only son. And the only words, to be honest with you, Devon, that could have sufficed for such a salvific resurrection were thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That may not sound like a lot to you right now, but when you look back over some of the troubling, twisted, tedious times of your life, sometimes the only thing you could say at that moment was thank you. Thank you. And just like this young man, some of you have some things you ought to be thankful for. You're thankful for that person who saw past your tears and saw triumph. You're thankful for that person who saw past your helplessness and saw hopefulness. Thankful for someone who looked past your sadness and saw strength. Thankful for someone who removed your insecurities and saw empowerment. Thankful for somebody who took your debt and gave you eternal riches. Thankful for someone who took your problems and gave you peace. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for changing me. Thank you for healing me. Thank you for delivering me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for honoring me. Thank you for encouraging me. Thank you for undergirding me. Thank you for hoping in me. Thank you for serving me. Thank you for defending me. Thank you for reviving me. Thank you, Christ, for lifting my limits, for confirming my courage, for affirming my actions, for realizing my relevance, for fortifying my faithfulness. Thank you, Christ, for meeting my crisis. Thank you, Christ, for raising my hopes. Brothers and sisters, this is the God that we serve. In the movie theaters of our lives, when we think that the film is over, God reminds us to take a seat, be still, and know that I am God. God is still speaking. God is still living. God is still working in you, through you, and around you. God is still in the business of raising our hopes. So don't give up on God. Don't give up on yourselves. And don't give up on our community. God bless you.